The photograph told a story nobody knew how to read. For 20 years, it sat in a silver frame on the mantelpiece in the silent house, a frozen moment from the last week of October, 1985. It was a simple family portrait taken in the central courtyard of their home in the Barrio de Xochimilco, in Oaxaca de Juarez. In the image, Dr. Alejandro Montoya stood tall, a man of science with a reserved smile. His wife, Isabel Rios de Montoya, was beside him, her hands clasped, a hint of an old sadness in her eyes that even the Oaxacan sun couldn't erase. Between them was their daughter, Soledad, 16 years old, her gaze directed just slightly away from the camera, as if distracted by a sound only she could hear. The photo was a relic of a life that ended just days after the shutter clicked. Before that final picture, their lives were measured by predictable rhythms. The Montoya family home, an old colonial structure built around a courtyard, bursting with Isabel's plants, was a place of quiet, almost academic order. Every morning the air smelled of damp earth and brewing coffee from Café Brujula. Dr. Alejandro Montoya, a respected astronomy professor at the Benito Juarez Autonomous University of Oaxaca, would leave for his classes, his mind, on distant galaxies and cosmic laws. Isabel, a botanist, would retreat to her nursery, her fingers deep in the soil of native succulents and fragrant bougainvillea, finding a solace there that the house, heavy with an unspoken loss from years before, could no longer offer. Their world was contained within the cobblestone streets of Xochimilco, punctuated by the distant bells of the Templo de Santo Domingo and the sweet, smoky scent of corn from a neighbor's kitchen. Soledad Montoya Rios, known to everyone as Sol, lived in the space between her parents, two worlds. She was a quiet girl, more an observer than a participant, with an intellect that absorbed everything. Some afternoons she spent with her mother, learning the scientific names of plants and the local Zapotec folklore tied to them. Other evenings she was on the flat rooftop with her father, peering through his large telescope at the moons of Jupiter and the faint smudges of nebulae. Alejandro taught her the physics of dying stars. Isabel taught her the cycles of dormant seeds. Sol loved them both deeply, but at 16 she had begun to sense the fracture in their home's foundation. It was a silence that had nothing to do with peace, a tension that hummed just beneath the surface of their polite dinner conversations about scientific discoveries and blooming seasons. Their days were woven from a fabric of quiet, predictable threads. The first light would filter through the high windows of the colonial house, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cool morning air. The scent of damp earth from the courtyard always came first, a rich, fertile smell that was soon joined by the aroma of dark Oaxacan coffee being prepared in the kitchen. Alejandro would be the first one dressed. In simple pressed trousers and a crisp cotton shirt, his mind already calculating orbital mechanics. Isabel would move through the house in her worn cotton fuipil, her movements soft and deliberate as she sliced papaya and set out the astric pan dulce. Their breakfast conversations were sparse, marked by the clink of spoons against ceramic and the distant, rising hum of the city. By 8, Alejandro would be gone, his leather briefcase in hand, leaving behind a silence that was neither empty nor peaceful. Alejandro Montoya lived a life of empirical certainty. His walk to the university was a study in observation, but not of the people or the vibrant street art that colored the walls of Xochimilco. He noted the angle of the sun, the predictable patterns of traffic, the physics of the ancient aqueduct that shadowed his path. He was a kind man, a loving father, but his emotions were processed through a filter of logic. He saw the world as a series of solvable problems, and he found comfort in the immutable laws of the universe. The superstitions and fervent faith of his neighbors were, to him, fascinating cultural artifacts, but ultimately irrational. He loved his wife and daughter with a deep, protective instinct, but he believed that the best way to shield them from pain was to build a life founded on facts, on things that could be proven and measured, leaving no room for the messy, unpredictable nature of grief. Isabel Rios de Montoya found her truth in the soil. After Alejandro left, she would retreat to her nursery in the courtyard, a space that was entirely her own. Here, the world made a different kind of sense. It was a place of cycles, of patient waiting, and sudden, vibrant bursts of life. Her hands, perpetually stained with earth, would gently repot native succulents, her fingers expertly checking the health of their roots. She spoke to her plants, not in full sentences, but in soft murmurs of encouragement. She found a spiritual connection in the unfurling of a fern, or the tenacious bloom of a cactus that mirrored her own quiet resilience. The nursery was her sanctuary, a place where the unspoken sorrow that haunted the rooms of the house could be composted into something that, if not beautiful, was at least alive and growing under the warm Oaxacan sun. Soledad existed in the quiet orbit of these two worlds. Her afternoons were a pendulum, swinging between the earth and the sky. Some days she would sit with Isabel in the shade of the courtyard, learning the Zapotec names for medicinal herbs and the folklore tied to the changing seasons. Her mother taught her a language of patience, of listening to the land. On other evenings, she would climb the stone steps to the flat rooftop, where her father had his telescope aimed at the heavens. He would point out the faint glow of the Andromeda galaxy or trace the constellations, explaining the chemistry of dying stars and the mathematical elegance of the cosmos. Sol absorbed it all, her mind a fertile ground for both science and story, but she was beginning to feel the immense, silent gravity of the secret that held her parents in their separate, lonely orbits. As evening fell, the family would reconvene in the dining room, the air thick with the scent of jasmine from the courtyard and corn from a neighbor's kitchen. Dinner was a polite affair. Alejandro might discuss a new paper on black holes, and Isabel would share news of a rare orchid that had finally bloomed. They spoke of everything except the one thing that defined them, the absence of their infant son, who had died years before. His name was never mentioned, but his ghost sat at the table with them every night, a silent presence that made the food taste a little less savory, the conversation a little more hollow. The house, which was a place of quiet work during the day, became a vessel for a profound, shared silence at night, a silence heavy with the weight of words that had been buried so long ago they had forgotten how to speak them. The day the photograph was taken was a Sunday, the last one in October. The air in Oaxaca held that unique quality of autumn, a warmth from the sun that felt thin against a cool, underlying breeze. It had been Isabel's idea. She'd insisted they needed a proper family portrait, something to mark the year, something more formal than the candid snapshots scattered in a drawer. So Javier, her brother, had come over, bringing his old Pentax camera and a heavy tripod. He set it up in the center of the courtyard, positioning them against a wall draped in flowering bougainvillea. The light was perfect, soft and golden, filtering through the leaves and casting dappled shadows on the stone pavers. Alejandro stood stiffly, unused to such staged moments, his hands clasped behind his back, as if he were about to deliver a lecture. Isabel arranged herself beside him, smoothing the fabric of her dress, a small, forced smile on her lips. Javier fussed with the lens, his hands, calloused and stained with engine grease, seeming clumsy as he adjusted the focus. He was a man of few words, and his directions were gruff and simple. "A little closer together," he grumbled, squinting through the viewfinder. "Alejandro, try to look like you're not calculating the trajectory of a meteor." A flicker of irritation crossed the professor's face before he composed it into a mask of placid patience. Isabel placed a gentle hand on Saul's shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but it felt more like an anchor, holding her daughter in place. She whispered for Saul to smile for her uncle, her voice a soft plea that was almost carried away by the breeze rustling the jacaranda leaves. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the simple, heavy effort of appearing to be a happy, cohesive unit for the camera's impartial eye. Soledad stood between them, a quiet space in the composition. She was wearing a simple white blouse, and around her neck hung a small, silver locket on a delicate chain, a gift from her mother years ago. As Javier stepped away from the camera to set the timer, Saul's eyes followed him. For a fraction of a second, just before the timer's whirring began, her gaze met her uncle's. It was not a look of simple distraction. It was a glance of understanding, a silent, fleeting communication that passed between them, invisible to her parents who were focused on the lens. Her expression in that moment was not one of teenage restlessness, but of a quiet, somber resolve. Her hand instinctively rose to touch the locket at her throat, a small, protective gesture that no one, not even the camera, seemed to truly capture. It was a secret hidden in plain sight. The shutter clicked, a sharp, metallic sound that sliced through the afternoon quiet. The moment was frozen. The tension immediately broke. Alejandro cleared his throat and stepped back, already thinking about the papers on his desk. Isabel's practiced smile fell away, replaced by a look of weary relief. Saul dropped her hand from the locket and turned her head, her gaze shifting toward the street beyond the courtyard gate, as if already looking for an escape. Javier began to carefully dismantle the tripod, the task of packing his equipment a welcome distraction from the strained family dynamic. It was just a photograph, one of dozens that would be taken and forgotten. No one knew it was a final document, a portrait of the last few hours of their life as they understood it, capturing the precise moment before the silence that haunted their home would become absolute and eternal. 3 days later, on the evening of November 2nd, 1985, the city of Oaxaca was a river of light and scent. The air, thick with the sweet earthy smell of cempasúchil and the smoky perfume of copal incense, hummed with a festive solemnity. It was Dia de Muertos a night when the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest. Soledad, who was supposed to be studying for a physics exam, told her parents she was going to a friend's house just a few blocks away. She wanted to see their family's ofrenda, she explained, the elaborate altar laden with sugar skulls and her friend's grandfather's favorite brand of mezcal. She promised she would be back in an hour. Isabel watched her walk out of the courtyard gate, a small, hand-embroidered bag over her shoulder, and turn onto the dimly lit cobblestone street, disappearing into the procession of families heading toward the cemetery. The first hour passed with the distant crackle of fireworks and the murmur of prayers from the street. Alejandro, lost in the scientific journal, barely noticed. But as the second hour began, a knot of unease tightened in Isabel's stomach. The initial annoyance at a teenager's casual disregard for time slowly curdled into a cold, creeping dread. By 10 o'clock, the dread had become panic. They started the search themselves, their calls of "Sal" swallowed by the celebratory noise of the city. They pushed through crowds carrying candles and bouquets of marigolds, their frantic questions met with confused shrugs. The familiar streets of Xochimilco, usually a source of comfort, had transformed into a labyrinth of laughing skeletons and masked faces, each one a stranger, none of them their daughter. The vibrant, fragrant night of remembrance had become the beginning of their own endless, silent vigil. The next morning they went to the police. The station was chaotic, and the commander, a weary, mustachioed man named Captain Diaz, was sympathetic but offered little immediate hope. On a night like Muertos he explained, anything could happen. Resources were stretched thin. An official investigation was launched, but it felt sluggish, bureaucratic. Flyers were printed, featuring a black and white school photograph of Sol, her smile hauntingly serene. Alejandro and Javier pasted them on the ancient walls of the aqueduct, on the doors of the Templo de Santo Domingo, and in the bustling stalls of the Mercado Benito Juarez. For weeks, Sol's face stared out from every corner of the city, a silent question that the sun-drenched streets of Oaxaca seemed unable or unwilling to answer. The formal search yielded nothing but paperwork and hollow reassurances. The community rallied at first. Isabel's friends from her church group held prayer circles, their voices rising in a soft chorus of Hail Marys, their faith a fragile shield against the encroaching despair. Alejandro, frustrated by what he saw as mystical nonsense, tried to conduct his own logical inquiry. He created maps, charted timelines, and interviewed Sol's friends with the detached precision of a scientist, but every path led to a dead end. Whispers began to circulate through the barrio. Old Senora Elena, who sold seslayudas from her doorway, swore she saw Sol get into a car with a young man she didn't recognize. Others suggested she had simply run away, a secret boyfriend waiting in another state. The theory of a kidnapping was floated, but no ransom note ever arrived, leaving only the most chilling, unspoken possibilities hanging in the air. As days turned into weeks, the theories grew darker, more entwined with the folklore of the region. The old Zapotec women at the market, their faces as wrinkled as dried chili, spoke in hushed tones. They said that on a night like Muertos the spirits of the dead were not always benevolent. They whispered that an angry soul, a lost one, might have taken the girl, pulling her across the thin veil into their world. Alejandro scoffed at these superstitions, dismissing them as the fictions of an uneducated mind. He found the stories insulting, an irrational distraction from the concrete, physical fact of his missing daughter. But for Isabel, who had always felt the presence of something more than the visible world, these tales planted a seed of profound, spiritual terror in the barren soil of her grief. Javier, Isabel's brother, was a stoic presence in those first few weeks. He drove the dusty roads leading out of the city, his mechanic's eyes scanning every ditch and abandoned field, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He spoke little, his anger a low, simmering heat directed at Alejandro's cold logic and the police's incompetence. But then, as the formal search wound down and hope began to decay, he retreated. He stopped coming to the house, his silence becoming another heavy stone in the foundation of their sorrow. The flyers, curled and faded by the Oaxacan sun, were eventually torn down or covered over. The city moved on. For the Montoya family, however, the noise of the search was replaced by a silence more absolute than any they had ever known, a silence that would fill their home for the next 20 years. 20 years passed. The year was now 2005. Time had not healed the wound. It had simply covered it with a thick gray layer of dust. In the house in the Barrio de Xochimilco, the silence had become a permanent resident, a tangible presence that muted sounds and dulled colors. The vibrant yellow paint on the courtyard walls had faded to a pale, tired ochre, cracked and peeling in the relentless Oaxacan sun. Outside the gate, the neighborhood had changed. New artisan shops had opened. Tourists now walked the cobblestone streets with digital cameras, and the familiar faces of old neighbors had been replaced by younger ones who knew nothing of the girl who vanished on *Muertos. The story of Soledad Montoya was no longer a tragedy but a forgotten whisper, a piece of local folklore that had lost its power to frighten or sadden anyone but the two people who lived inside the quiet, waiting house. Alejandro Montoya, at 65, was a retired man haunted by a single unsolvable equation. The sharp, analytical mind that once mapped the cosmos was now trapped in a circular, fruitless loop of memory and regret. He rarely went up to the roof anymore. The large telescope, his former pride, sat beneath a stiff, dusty tarp, its lens aimed at nothing, a monument to a time when he believed the universe held answers. His scientific certainty, the bedrock of his entire life, had been pulverized by an event that defied logic, leaving him bitter and withdrawn. He moved through the rooms of his home like a ghost, his shoulders stooped, his eyes holding the flat, empty light of a man who had looked for a pattern in the chaos and found only a void. The stars he once taught his daughter to love now offered no comfort, only a cold, vast indifference. Isabel Rios de Montoya, now 63, found her only solace in the earth. Her nursery was the one place where life continued its predictable, reassuring cycle. Her hands, now mapped with the fine lines of age, still moved with expert gentleness among her succulents and bougainvillea, her connection to the soil the only thing that kept her anchored to the present. But her most sacred ritual took place inside. Every Tuesday she would enter Soledad's bedroom, a space perfectly preserved since 1985. She would carefully dust the astronomy books on the shelf, wipe the glass on the framed chart of lunar phases, and smooth the simple woven blanket on the bed. It was an act of desperate faith, a quiet insistence that the room must be ready. This sanctuary of memory was both her burden and her purpose, a weekly pilgrimage to the heart of her grief. The absence of Soledad was felt not as an emptiness, but as a constant, heavy presence. Her 16th birthday had been the last one acknowledged. Every October since, the date would pass in a silence even deeper than usual, an anniversary of loss marked by unspoken thoughts and averted gazes. The small objects she left behind, a worn copy of a poetry book on her nightstand, a pair of scuffed leather sandals by the door, were holy relics. Conversations between Alejandro and Isabel had long ago withered. They no longer discussed scientific papers or the Zapotec names for plants. They spoke of household necessities, of the weather, of nothing. There were two planets that had been knocked from their orbits, moving around a void, their shared sorrow, a gravitational force that kept them close, but forever prevented them from touching. It was an ordinary Tuesday in late October of 2005, almost exactly 20 years after Soledad had vanished. The air was heavy with the coming rains, and the house felt especially still. Isabel was dusting the living room, her movements slow and methodical, a ritual that had long ago lost its meaning and become pure habit. She picked up the silver frame from the mantelpiece, the one holding the last photograph. The silver had tarnished to a dark gray at the edges, and a fine layer of dust had settled on the glass. For the first time in years, she felt a sudden, sharp impulse, not just to wipe it, but to truly clean it. With trembling fingers, she worked open the small metal tabs on the back, and carefully slid the photograph out of its frame, holding the faded color print in her hands for the first time in 2 decades. Freed from the glass and the tarnished frame, the photograph seemed different. The colors were muted, the faces of her husband and daughter soft with the passage of time. As she held it under the light filtering in from the courtyard, her eyes were drawn to a dark area in the upper left corner, the shadowed pane of a window behind Alejandro's shoulder. It had always looked like a meaningless smudge, a flaw in the developing process. But now, holding the print itself, she could see a faint, distorted shape within the darkness. Her eyesight was no longer sharp enough to decipher it. She walked into Alejandro's study, a room he rarely used anymore, and opened the top drawer of his desk. She rummaged past old pens and paper clips until her fingers found what she was looking for: his heavy, brass magnifying glass. She carried it back to the living room, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She sat down and held the magnifying glass over the corner of the photograph. The world of the image expanded, the grain of the film becoming visible like tiny colored stones. And then the smudge resolved into a clear, undeniable scene. It was a reflection. In the dark window, the street outside the courtyard gate was perfectly mirrored. Parked there, just out of direct sight, was Javier's old blue Ford pickup truck, its shape as familiar to her as her own hands. And beside the open passenger door stood a small figure, a girl in a white blouse. The reflection was tiny, distorted by the old glass, but there was no mistaking it. The figure was leaning in, placing a small, embroidered bag onto the passenger seat. The air left Isabel's lungs in a silent rush. The photograph, which for 20 years had been a monument to a stolen future, was suddenly something else entirely. It was evidence. It was a confession captured on film. Soledad's distracted gaze toward her uncle was not a fleeting distraction. It was a final, silent confirmation of their plan. Javier's gruffness as he set up the camera was not his usual impatience. It was the anxiety of a man complicit in a secret departure. The entire scene was a meticulously staged farewell, a final portrait not of a family about to be broken by tragedy, but of a family that was already broken, from which a daughter was quietly, deliberately escaping. The mystery was not who took Saul, but why she had been so desperate to leave them all behind. Isabel did not cry. The shock was too deep, a cold, heavy stone settling in the pit of her stomach, displacing 2 decades of carefully tended grief. The sorrow she had nurtured, a sorrow rooted in the violence of abduction, in the evil of strangers, in the cosmic unfairness of the universe, evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a grief that was sharper, more personal, and infinitely more painful. It was the grief of abandonment, the grief of betrayal, both by her daughter and by her own brother. She sat there in the silent living room, the magnifying glass fallen from her lap, holding the small, square photograph in her hands. It was no longer a memory. It was the truth, and its weight felt heavier than all the years of not knowing combined. When she finally rose, hours later, the photograph was still clutched in her hand, its edges softened by the warmth of her palm. She did not go to Alejandro. The truth was a fragile, venomous thing, too complex to be spoken aloud, for it implicated her own blood. Instead, she walked out of the house and through the quiet afternoon streets to Javier's small mechanic shop on the edge of the city. The large blue door was rolled up, and inside, parked in the shadows, was the old Ford pickup truck. It was rustier now, its paint faded by 2 decades of sun, but it was unmistakably the same. She stood across the street, watching the truck, a silent witness that had held its secret for 20 years. Javier was not there. It didn't matter. The sight of the vehicle was the only confirmation she needed. It was a final, quiet conversation with a ghost. In the days that followed, the silence in the Montoya house changed its nature. It was no longer a shared space of unknowing, a vacuum they inhabited together. It became a wall, thick and cold, built from a truth only one of them possessed. Alejandro noticed the shift, a new stillness in Isabel, a finality in her gaze he couldn't decipher. She still tended her nursery, her hands moving through the soil with the same practiced care, but the ritual no longer seemed like an act of faith. It was a duty. When she dusted Soledad's room, it was not to keep it ready for a miraculous return, but to tend a grave. The room was no longer a sanctuary of hope, but a perfectly preserved monument to a deliberate and final choice. They were now truly alone, orbiting not a shared loss but separate, irreconcilable pains. One evening, a week after her discovery, Isabel walked to the mantelpiece. Alejandro was sitting in his chair, a book open but unread in his lap, watching her. She picked up the tarnished silver frame. Her movements were slow, without anger or tremor, filled with a profound, weary resignation. She held the photograph for a moment, the image of their last, false moment as a family facing her one final time. Then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, she turned the frame around, placing it back on the mantel with its blank, velvet-covered back facing the room. The story was over. The search was done. There was nothing left to see. The gesture settled between them, more definitive than any word, and the house fell into a new, absolute silence, punctuated only by the sound of dust, settling on a story that had finally and irrevocably been closed.